Campaign 2024 got down to business in Iowa this weekend as most of the declared or potential Republican candidates visited the early nominating state. Notably absent the GOP frontrunner, former President Donald Trump, who was off the trail this weekend. Joining us now to discuss are three of our sharpest political reporters: CBS News political correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns, Ed O'Keefe is senior White House and political correspondent, and Robert Costa is our chief elections and campaigns correspondent. Welcome to you all. I want to start with you on Donald Trump, because we learned from the Department of Justice that they will not be bringing charges against Mike Pence for his classified document that he was mishandling. What do we know about the case against Mr. Trump?
Sources with knowledge of the investigation believe that a charging decision in the documents case on the federal level being led by the special counsel is imminent. It could be coming in the next few weeks. In fact, the grand jury might have some activity this week. We hear from sources close to this investigation. We also hear that the Trump lawyers might be meeting at some point with the Justice Department to talk through where things stand.
When will we know, when you say the next few weeks and imminent? There is a Republican debate in August. Are we going to know the answer to this before they all take the stage?
The investigations, Margaret, over former President Trump, they loom over this entire presidential race. We hear that a charging decision could be made in June on the documents case. The January 6th investigation by the special counsel continues, but that could end up going into 2024 when some of these primaries are unfolding next year. But right before the debate, the thing to pay attention to, a charging decision and a possible indictment in Georgia, where Trump is being investigated for pressuring election officials. That could come in early August, just weeks before that first debate in Milwaukee in late August.
This is going to be an incredible primary season with that. I want to turn to you, Caitlin, because when they take this debate stage, in order to even walk on alongside Mr. Trump or whomever else, there are some parameters that are being set. We know there are at least 10 Republicans who may be on the stage. Mm-hmm. To get up there, they have to agree to endorse whoever the nominee is.
Yeah, they're being asked to sign this loyalty pledge. And what's interesting about this field is that when you ask the candidates, will you commit to supporting Donald Trump if he's the nominee, they really won't say. I've interviewed Mike Pence and Tim Scott, and they have not been able to answer that question. On the other hand, Trump hasn't been able to answer that question either. He hasn't said whether he will support the eventual nominee if it's not him, or if he will participate in the debates altogether. That still remains kind of a wild card here. He could be advantaged skipping the first debate. He's ahead of the polls, of course. He's the front runner, at least at this point. But at the same time, if he does skip the debate, that does give his rivals the opportunity to make their case as the alternative without having to stand there and kind of weather the attacks.
But that assumes there are attacks, right? I mean, we're listening to some of these speeches out in Iowa, Ed. He was the candidate who loomed large, but his name was not spoken.
That's right.
And Chris Christie, who may be jumping in, one of the few who does take aim directly at the former president, but he said he's not going to be a hired assassin. That's what he told Politico.
Right. Look, there's a ceiling that he's hitting right now, about 35-40%. Everyone else in this race knows that. And they're focused on that 60% or so that's still out there to be had. Everything is Donald Trump's to lose. I think anyone showing up to an event hosted by somebody else is clearly curious. And the idea of all the legal matters he's facing, all the personal issues he's dragged along with him through the years, is on the minds of these voters, especially in Iowa, where we were this week. A lot of them saying, look, if he's ultimately the guy, I'll pull the plug, I'll be there for him. But all this stuff or this baggage, you know, I'm kind of done with it, and I'm hoping somebody else rises. And the names we hear, Ron DeSantis, Tim Scott, Nikki Haley, are the three that came from voters' voices most frequently when talking about somebody else. Mm-hmm. All of them understand they've got to lay out what they're about, what they would do differently, because they're obviously not Donald Trump. And DeSantis, notably, several times over the course of this past week, was asked about Trump or made inferences to him in his remarks, making it clear that he thinks the party has to move on. He called his attacks juvenile, said that's why he lost voters back in 2020 and why he won't be able to drag them back. I mean, if that's not the argument some other Republican isn't going to make, right. You know, what will work to convince those Republicans otherwise? But
then that question, Robert, is always, does a possible movement in this case, does an indictment, for hypothetical purposes, matter here? Or is that even what we're talking about at this point?
To build on what Caitlin and Ed laid out, there's a real wait-and-see mentality with so many of these campaigns. They don't want to attack Trump on the investigations. They want to see all of that run its course. But they are starting to not necessarily attack Trump, but take out the scalpel on policy. And you can expect Pence, when he gets into the race this week, according to people close to him, to start saying Trump is not conservative enough to be the Republican nominee. And you're also seeing that same type of attack from Governor DeSantis, coming at Trump from the right, linking him with Dr. Anthony Fauci, saying the response to the pandemic was too favorable to corporations, too federal in its nature. So this is a different kind of position for Trump to be in, not to be facing questions about his conduct or his character, but about his conservatism. It's
fascinating. Caitlin, you have been looking very closely at the issue of abortion as this galvanizing political force. President Biden had said that he would set a national standard of access up to the point of viability, which is roughly 24 weeks under Roe versus Wade. But the Republican candidates each has a different answer here, and they don't seem to have a unified position on how to handle something that is so politically loaded.
Exactly. Well, Republicans right now are caught between a primary electorate that is cheering the overturning of Roe versus Wade and a general electorate, a broader electorate that has really rejected that decision. We saw that at the ballot box in 2022, and especially in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. We saw it earlier this year in Wisconsin. When you talk to Republicans, operatives, and also those on the anti-abortion side, they want the candidates to be engaging in this issue because they feel like they ceded ground last time around. And so you do have groups like Susan B. Anthony List pushing candidates to take a stance on federal abortion restrictions. And that has kind of tied these candidates up in knots. I think what changed this week, however, is how the candidates were talking about it in Iowa. Obviously, Iowa is where the evangelical base is. Governor Kim Reynolds signed a 6-week abortion ban there. So you heard Governor DeSantis talking about that, playing up his 6-week abortion ban that he signed into law in Florida. That's a play for those voters, and they're more open about it. We also got a more concrete answer from Donald Trump, who has tried to kind of avoid this altogether, trying to remind voters that he was responsible for overturning.
But the Republican line on this had been it's up to the states. And I thought it was interesting when Nikki Haley was on this program recently, she said candidates are not being honest when they claim it's possible to get a national law on abortion.
And there is some truth to that, right? The idea of having 60 senators to pass anything is unlikely. But it is trying to kind of thread that needle between the primary electorate that you need to come out and support you in a place like Iowa and general electorates, especially women. Also notable that they'll play this issue differently in New Hampshire, Nevada than they do in Iowa and South Carolina.
Ed, I have to ask you about the man running for re-election, President Joe Biden. Yeah. It was a big week for him with this bipartisan deal. But in that speech from the Oval Office, it went quickly from very bipartisan to a bit of a campaign speech.
Yeah, let's raise taxes on the
exactly
on the wealthy, and let's remind ourselves of what Republicans were pushing for in that deal that didn't get through. The goal through the end of this year is to just keep him being president, looking presidential. He's got meetings this week with the Danish and British prime ministers. He's going to have some events on the economy. He's meeting with the Kansas City Chiefs. All of that sort of checks the box of I'm commander-in-chief, I'm in charge. Look at the big deal I just got. He'll be raising a lot of money between now and the end of the year. Not a lot of campaigning. That's not because of his age. That's not because of his vigor. It's consistent with what President Obama did back in 2011 and going into 2012. And they believe if he can raise all that money now, they'll be more than happy to spend it next year. And they want to just sit back and watch Republicans squabble over how many weeks of a ban should there be for abortion, who's conservative enough, knowing that they should be able to go into those elections next year in the 6 or 7 battleground states and hope that they can continue to make the compelling argument. They worry that if it's not Trump, there's a generational argument to be had, which is why you saw Ron DeSantis alongside his wife and young kids so much in recent days, and you'll continue to. It's also why they got to get the vice president out there a bit more to talk about issues of concern, especially to the base.
All right. This is going to be a very interesting campaign season. Thanks to all of you.
It's just starting.
It's just starting. But get ready for a busy summer. There's no slow summers anymore, news-wise. Thanks to all of you for joining us.